So this is probably going to be my most personal video to date. In this video, I want to talk about my experience as a Chinese American adoptee. I'm going to talk about what I've gone through in my life and just kind of vent about it. I'm not here to get sympathy or pity, but rather this video and this script is mainly for me, but I think that it'll help other people, especially if you're part of a marginalized community, because if you are part of a marginalized community, I think that you understand when I say that your identity can sometimes become a spectacle. So without further ado, let's go. So I grew up in the US during the early and mid 2000s. More specifically, I grew up in a white affluent suburb in New Jersey. But before this, I was actually born in China in 1995 and was adopted when I was around a year old. And I was adopted into a white household and into a household that was multi-generational, meaning that I lived with my grandmother, my mom, who is a single parent, and me. My family was white, and even my grandmother, God rest her soul, who was an immigrant from Cuba, was a white Cuban, though of course went through her own struggles with being seen as an outsider in a very waspy society. Anyway, it wasn't until I started school that I realized that, my identity was different than other people's, than most people's, at least in the place that I grew up. Most people, didn't come from multi-generational households. They had two parents, and they weren't adopted. My school also really wasn't racially diverse. In my grade, there was one black kid, another East Asian kid from South Korea, and an Indian student. And that was basically it as far as racial and ethnic diversity. I remember in 5th grade, we had to bring in baby photos of ourselves and then match the baby photo to the student. And I remember, it was just so othering. And throughout grade school, K through 12, I was, bullied during this time for just being me, for being Asian, for not having two parents, and for being adopted. And my mom at the time, at least when I was a kid, 10 years or younger, in elementary school, thought it was a good idea to try to educate my peers on my identity, but I personally just wanted to disappear. I wanted to assimilate the best way that I could, but I just couldn't because I couldn't help just existing. I was being mocked for things that were out of my control. Kids would yell ching chong at me, bow to me, ask me to speak Chinese, ask me what the orphanage was like, ask me what I would do if I met my real parents, asked me if my mom was a lesbian, and asked me if I ate dogs, if people killed babies where I came from, etc. And this all really sucked because I couldn't do anything about who I was. Looking back now, I know that a lot of the kids probably just bullied me because they felt threatened by someone who had a different background than them, who looked so different, etc. They just didn't know how to interact with someone like that. But unfortunately, comments like these didn't stop when I graduated high school, or even when I graduated college. They continue to this day. Just the other day I was talking to someone and the one-child policy came up, and they asked me kind of in a joking way, isn't there a law in China that you can't have more than one kid? What happens when you have more than one? Do they kill them? And again, they said this in a joking way, but I answered them pretty deadpan, yeah, they do. Or at least they did until the law was overturned in 2016. Part of being an adoptee from China because of the one-child policy means that you kind of harbor this, survivor's guilt because you essentially survived a mass killing. There's a really good documentary on Amazon called One Child Nation, and if you have the time, I suggest checking it out. It's really intense. But anyway, throughout my young adult life and school life and work life, people will just never stop asking me where I'm from, and if I say I'm from New Jersey or from the US, they ask me where my parents are from, or they just assume, you're Japanese, right? You're Korean, aren't you? And I wish I could just shout at these people and say, why do you care so much about who I am or what my identity is? What's it to you? What if I just started to assume things about your identity? How would that make you feel? But I do understand that my backstory is very convoluted. Like, I'm very well aware that it is weird to hear that I was born in China, but that I'm from the US, or that I identify as American or whatever. I understand, like, people might wonder, how does that work? But then if you start getting into the adoption conversation, that's like a whole other can of worms. So at this point, I've actually stopped telling people that I'm adopted, and when I say people, I mean strangers that I will never see again. And I've done this because it's so annoying how coworkers and just your fellow peers or even strangers expect you to perform your trauma for them so then they could try to figure you out, or because they want to preach about X, Y, or Z and use you as a jumping off point. Like, when people ask me if in China they eat dogs, they're usually only asking me that so then they can go on like this whole political rant about how China is this awful, terrible place, and then they just expect me to like listen to them, or maybe they want me to jump into this debate, but I don't really know what they want from this interaction at all. I remember in school when I was really little, kids would ask me to write something in Chinese or say something in Chinese, and I would just make random shit up for them to leave me alone. When kids would come up to me when I was a kid and ask me if I ate dogs or if in China they ate dogs, I would just say yes on the basis of literally nothing, just so they could leave me alone. But that was the wrong thing to do, because then that just gave them more fuel to bully me with. In the end, it's just really aggravating, because if you don't say anything, then you become one of the cool ones. And then these people start getting very comfortable around you and start to say even more heinous things, and you can't say anything because you haven't created any boundaries. Not only that, but if you do speak up, you're no longer one of the cool ones, and you're making a big deal out of nothing, and you risk being further alienated away from your peers and community. Anti-Asian racism in the US has a long and complex history, and it's hard to even know where to begin when talking about it, because the Asian community is so vast, and Asia itself is so vast, and depending on where you're from, you face different stereotypes and different forms of racism. So since I'm Chinese American, for this section I'll only be doing a very brief rundown of the history of Chinese American racism. So let's go. The first Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. in the mid-1800s during the California Gold Rush. Some Chinese ended up making a fortune and going back to China, but most were used for laborers and ended up being used for dangerous jobs that white workers weren't suited for. And when there's a gold rush, the people making the most money are usually the ones selling the buckets. The gold rush also coincided with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, in which the Chinese American immigrants participated as laborers. Though many Chinese immigrants returned to China, many settled to create a new life and/or because they never made enough money to return to their homeland. But of course, they weren't welcomed with open arms. In fact, they were forced into what we know today as Chinatowns because of racist attacks on their communities. In addition, many were tasked with low-paying jobs either in laundry, cooking, or construction due to the fact that the majority of the Chinese American population was made up of male workers. This increased the animosity between the Chinese and the whites because since the Chinese would work for close to nothing, they were stealing jobs from the white cohort. This caused the white workers to go on strike, as they blamed the Chinese for depressing wages. At one point, Chinese men represented nearly a quarter of all wage-earning workers in California. In 1879, the California state government felt compelled enough to ban Chinese workers from being able to work in public government constructions, which they were known for. Then, 3 years later, the federal government passed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Chester A. Arthur. This act provided an absolute 10-year ban on Chinese laborers immigrating to the U.S. For the first time, federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. In 1943, when China was a member of the Allied nations during World War II, Congress repealed all exclusion acts. However, quotas remained, leaving a yearly limit of 105 Chinese immigrants. Foreign-born Chinese also won the right to seek naturalization. The so-called national origin system, with various modifications, lasted until Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1965. Effective July 1, 1968, a limit of 170,000 immigrants from outside the Western Hemisphere could enter the U.S., with a maximum of 20,000 from any one country. Skill and the need for political asylum determined admission. As this Migration Institute article states, with the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, the number of immigrants from Asian countries in the U.S. grew considerably. As of 2019, there were 14.1 million immigrants from Asia residing in the US, representing a 29-fold increase from 1960. Today, people born on the continent of Asia account for 31% of the 44.9 million immigrants in the US. In 2019, India, China, and the Philippines were the top origin countries of immigrants from Asia. While the majority of the pre-1965 immigrants from Asia were low-skilled laborers, the foreign-born from the region today are more likely than the overall US-born and immigrant populations to earn higher incomes, to work in management occupations, and to be highly educated, although these trends vary by country of origin. So basically, after the repeal of the Exclusion Act during the mid-60s, the US granted work visas specifically to Chinese immigrants with professional degrees, basically people who were seen as desirable. And that brings us to today, and why the current stereotypes of Chinese Americans is that they're basically white, so what do they have to complain about? They're all rich, naturally good at math and science, and all go to Ivy League colleges. What's the problem? And part of this is due to the overrepresentation of crazy rich Asian stories like The Bling Empire, House of Ho, and of course, Crazy Rich Asians. And though these are good stereotypes, they're still stereotypes that are used to distract from the fact that Chinese Americans still face racism. This can be perfectly illustrated in the rise of hate crimes against Chinese Americans and their businesses during COVID. The most notorious being the 2021 Atlanta spa shootings, in which Asian women were targeted. The president at the time called it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan flu, and continually blamed the Chinese for some grand conspiracy. The Chinese eat gross stuff narrative came back into conversation as the supposed reason the pandemic started was due to the rumor that it was because someone in China ate a bat. And even without the pandemic, we're still seen as perpetual foreigners. We're still not seen as American. We're still treated as outsiders. We're still fetishized by non-Asian people. The US prides itself on being the place for immigrants to start a new life and be a part of something great, a city upon a hill. But that really only applies if you're white. When it comes to being a Chinese American woman specifically, the stereotypes that we face are numerous. Mainly that we're all naturally demure and quiet, thin and obedient. There's both the stereotype that Asian women are innocent and sexually inexperienced and have the bodies of 12-year-olds, as well as the Dragon Lady Seductress stereotype, that we know ancient sex secrets and will give you a happy ending. None of that is true, and in fact, those stereotypes about Chinese women and East Asian women in general are even more harmful because we, as women, already deal with a lot of pressure to begin with. Now as Asian women, that pressure doubles. Overall, the racism that Chinese Americans face appears subtle, but in fact is pretty overt. And it's sad that it took unspeakable violence and a global pandemic to bring that conversation to the forefront. And this is a side note, but I don't think that we need to compare our struggle to other groups in order to prove that we have it just as bad, because then we're playing into the right's idea of some sort of oppression Olympics, rather than acknowledging that every struggle is different and that that's okay. I also want to take the time here to say that stereotypes are based on lies and falsehoods. And I'm saying this here, and I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent about this because I think in another video I got a lot of comments saying that, stereotypes are wrong, but they are based in some truth, and I want to squash that out right here and now. Firstly, if we work under this assumption that stereotypes are based in some truth, then we fall into this argument that racism is justified because facts can sometimes back it up. If we think racism is wrong because factually it's incorrect, then we're going to spend our days wasting time debunking various falsehoods rather than fighting actual systems. Racism is wrong, period. Why is it wrong? It just is. There's no logical or factual ideology as to why it's wrong, and if you need facts as to why it's wrong to create and uphold a society that privileges one group of people over another based on physical traits, then you should just get out. In the end, racism is illogical. You will never logic someone out of an ideology they didn't logic themselves into. And if you think some stereotypes are true or based in some truth, then you're agreeing with the logic of the racist, and then they win because you have to debate on their level. Sean illustrates this perfectly in his video about Harry Potter. He argues that Rowling has a very limited idea of what racism is. No surprise there. And the way she fights racism in her books is to agree with the racist, but then create exceptions to the rule, thus debunking X, Y, or Z. For example, Sean points out that in one scene Hagrid says that it doesn't matter that Hermione is Muggle-born because she's a great witch, while Neville, a pureblood, is mediocre at best. Therefore, racism is defeated with facts and logic. But racism is illogical, therefore it can't be debunked with facts and logic. We just need to agree that it's wrong morally, and if you have an ounce of empathy in your heart, you will understand that regardless if racial stereotypes are true or not. And what if Hermione wasn't good at magic? Would that mean preconceived notions about Muggleborns are okay then? If we believe stereotypes are based in some truth, then we're going to be going down a very slippery slope, is what I'm saying. And just to continue this tangent a little bit longer, let's bring it into the real world. A common stereotype about Chinese people and East Asians in general is that they're good at math. We're like human calculators and whiz kids. China has like the highest math scores in the world, or they did at one point or whatever. So factually, this stereotype seems to be based in some truth. And you might think, no harm, no foul. But if we try to reverse this overgeneralization and apply it to whites, we can see how ridiculous it is to assume that all Asian kids are just naturally math wizards. We don't assume all white kids are good at math because Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein were geniuses. We're simply able to see them as individuals. And let's say you meet an Asian person who's not good at math. You might think that doesn't debunk the whole stereotype. I mean, there are still a great many Asians who are good at math. So it is still true. And again, rather than realizing that this overgeneralization is used to dehumanize Asian people in order for non-Asians to continue to see them as a monolith to make them less threatening, you continue to believe the lie. Because stereotypes are easier to believe than doing the real work it takes to undo them. Another common stereotype is that Chinese people and East Asian people in general sweat less and don't need deodorant. And this has been factually backed up because many East Asians, including myself, lack the functional ABCC11 gene. It's non-functional in 80 to 95% of East Asians. So to repeat this exercise, you might think, oh, so that stereotype that East Asian people don't sweat is true. And thus go on to believe other stereotypes that East Asians, particularly East Asian women, are demure, ethereal children, and the men are effeminate as well. They don't sweat like real men do. And also, this fact can be true without turning it into a stereotype, or using it to enforce other stereotypes. And also, this lack of this certain gene doesn't mean we don't sweat, but rather we don't need deodorant. I'm not saying physical differences between races don't exist, but they shouldn't be used as reasons to overgeneralize billions of people and again, turn them into a monolith to mock and to feel superior to. So now that that's over, I hope that I made a pretty solid case on why stereotypes are lies and are based on falsehoods, and why we shouldn't believe or perpetuate them, even if there is some truth to them. As for my own part in the Asian community, or specifically in the Chinese American community, it's hard being in that space as an adoptee, even though to many outsiders I'm just as Chinese as Chinese Americans raised by Chinese immigrant parents. In college, I remember one of my Chinese American peers looking at me and telling me that I'm not really Chinese. And I just looked at her like, what the fuck is your problem? And I get what she meant, like culturally I'm not Chinese, I'm more similar to white America than anything else. But that doesn't mean I also don't face anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment, or that outsiders even understand how my experience is different from yours. In the end, we're all painted with the same brush, whether we like it or not. How many times has someone asked me if I can tell the difference between who's Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and in the end answer their own question and say it doesn't matter anyway because they all look the same, right? If they think people of different nationalities are basically clones of one another, who's to say two people of Chinese descent? How many times has someone insisted that I speak Chinese after telling them I grew up in an English-speaking household and was adopted when I was a baby? Outsiders don't care if I'm adopted. To them, I'm still Chinese. Rather than trying to divide the Chinese American community further, adoptees should be a part of the community because even though we have different cultural backgrounds, that doesn't mean we don't have similar experiences. And though I haven't felt very welcome in Asian American and Chinese American spaces as an adoptee, that didn't stop me from learning about Chinese American history and Chinese history and culture, whether it be from books, college professors, and courses, as well as extracurriculars. Since I was a child, my mom was very insistent that I become very well versed in Chinese history and culture. We celebrated the Mid-Autumn Festival and Lunar New Year and watched Chinese language films. I took traditional Chinese dance classes and language classes as well as art classes. I really liked that part of my identity, and made friends who were also adopted through these activities. However, at times it did get grating in that my mom was insistent that I embrace this part of myself publicly in school with my classmates, who just didn't get any of it. I wanted so badly to keep this part of my identity a secret. I didn't even tell my best friends at the time that I went to Chinese school for almost a year. In the end, it was mainly a waste trying to bring Lunar New Year to a bunch of ignorant white kids and teaching Chinese history to them because it just gave them more stuff to bully me with. As an adult today, Chinese culture and history plays very little part in my everyday life, even though I still really do like learning about it and find it fascinating. I honestly really struggle to find any cultural identity besides the very broad and general US identity of the suburbs, high school, college, the American dream, consumerism, etc. I didn't stay in the country where I was born, so I can't experience authentic Chinese culture. I wasn't adopted into a Chinese American household, so I can't experience Chinese American culture. So all that's left is the culture and history of my adoptive family, which in the end isn't really mine. And unfortunately, I was adopted into a very dysfunctional family and household, so I never really felt outside of my immediate family that their family was also my family. This is, of course, just my own personal experience with adoption. I don't speak for all adoptees, obviously, but for me, adoption is and continues to be a really traumatic experience. And that's not adoption's fault necessarily. Everyone will experience their own feelings with adoption. It's the same as being born into a family that is dysfunctional. The only difference being you don't look like the people around you and you can feel othered even in your own home. Not to mention, there's always this nagging feeling in the back of my head that knows that I'm not where I'm supposed to be or was supposed to be. When I think about it, I should be living in China, and yet here I am. Fast forward today, and I'm living in Brazil. For those of you who don't know, I currently live in Ceará, which is in the northeast of Brazil. I've been living here since 2017, but I first came to Brazil in 2015 just to spend a few months in the summer during college. And in all honesty, I can say that I do love living in Brazil, and even though I don't feel at home 100% of the time, I think that's totally normal. And in fact, Asian Brazilians, as well as me as an Asian American foreigner in Brazil, hear a lot of similar comments that I heard in the US, for example. Yo Bambu, a channel that focuses on the Asian Brazilian experience, has made a few videos about comments Asian people get in Brazil, and it's very similar to comments I've heard in the US and now in Brazil. Mainly, open your eyes, where are you from, are you Japanese, but where are your parents from, etc. The same comments I got in the US I get here in Brazil. Do you eat dogs? Do you speak Chinese? Where are you from? And of course, when I say I'm from the US, no one believes me. Some comments are more specific to Brazil though. For example, the term xingi lingi is used in a derogatory way to refer to cheap electronics from Asia that are sold in downtown. There's also the phrase empanada de frango, or chicken empanada, where the R in frango is changed to an L sound, mocking the fact that I guess some Asian people can't pronounce R's correctly. Very original. In Brazil specifically, they don't use the term Asian to describe people who look Asian or East Asian. They instead use the word japa. Japa meaning Japanese, even though the way to say someone is Japanese is usually Japonês, but japa is like a slang term for that. And the reason why a lot of non-Asian Brazilians use the term japa to refer to people of East Asian descent is because Brazil has a large Japanese immigrant population that mainly lives in the South, but rather than calling, everyone who looks East Asian just Asian, they say Japa because of this large community. They just assume that, you must have some descendancy from Japan. And to non-Asians, this is inoffensive because everyone from East Asia looks the same, right? And all the cultures are basically the same. All the languages are basically the same. Japan, Korea, China, what's the difference? So they don't see anything wrong in just labeling all people from East Asia under this, Japa title. There's also China, which gets thrown around a lot. China just means China to refer to East Asian people, but the term, Asiatic or Asian isn't really used that often, at least in my experience. And if you ever point this out to like a non-Asian person, they'll say like, you can't even tell the difference between who's Japanese and who's Chinese, so how could I possibly be racist? And this, of course, is a similar sentiment that I've already heard before in the US. At the end of the day, people are just gonna be racist and see Asian people as perpetual foreigners, whether they're foreign-born or not. In this video, which asks Asian Brazilians how they feel when someone calls them Japa, some people are okay with it if it's a friend calling them that, or if they're just used to it, or if it's done in a cute and innocent way, but most say that it's annoying when a stranger does it. It makes them feel like they're reduced to their race. And some people outwardly just hate it, whether it be from strangers or not, because they're not Japanese, so why are you calling them that?
Teu cu.
Também não gosto que me chamam de chinês ou coreano, mesmo sendo chinês, mas eu gosto quando chamam pelo meu nome. Eu acho isso uma falta de respeito.
Já me ocorreram várias situações de eu estar conversando com alguém e aí essa pessoa se refere a mim como japa, e aí quando eu falo que eu sou descendente de coreano, a pessoa fala, mas tu também é a mesma coisa. E não é a mesma coisa.
At times, I still wish I was white. If I was a white American in Brazil, people would just, get that I'm American. I wouldn't have to explain myself, and people wouldn't assume that like I'm speaking some, Asian language. Hell, if I was a white American, I'd just be American. The ramifications of all this racism that I've faced and continue to face in my life is that mainly I just want to be left alone. I truly do just love being alone, and when I'm alone, I know that I'm not being othered. It's not like I wake up every day and think like, wow, I look different from other people. No, it's not until I go out into the world and I can compare myself with other people, or people come up at me or look at me differently, and that's when I realize that I'm different. And honestly, like, that just really sucks. It has also made me a lot more guarded, and I don't tell everyone I meet my entire story like I used to. Now I only reserve that part of myself for people who I think will truly understand it. And thankfully I have a few people in my life who are my very close friends and who do get it, and I'm just so thankful to them. In the end, I've had to create my own identity, and it's been really, really unimaginably difficult, and I'm still in the process of doing it. But as of right now, I like who I am, and I'm happy with who I am. It's something I'm really proud of, and even though I don't have any really strong connections with Asia, it's still part of my ethnicity, and it's still part of my everyday lived experience. For example, I was in the hospital and they had to mark what my race was, and race in Brazil is extremely complicated, but essentially it's, when it's on a form, it's based on phenotype, like what do you physically look like, and the options are usually white, black, brown, red, yellow, etc. And they were going to put white, but I had them put yellow because that's the closest to what I am. Being Asian is still a really important part of my identity, and I want people to know that. I mean, obviously they know that considering the comments that I get, and I want to be proud of that. Thankfully, in recent years, there have been a number of adopted Asian celebrities that have talked about their experiences in the Asian community. For example, Lana Condor has talked about how she didn't feel welcome in that space and even received comments that she shouldn't play Lara Jean because she wasn't Asian enough. In Brazil, there are famous Asian Brazilians, the most famous one being Sabrina Sato. In addition, Ana Hikari portrayed Tina Yamada in Malhação, a show for young people from 2017 to 2018. So things are slowly getting better, but not fast enough. At this point in my life, I am really proud of what I've become and of who I am. But now that I have a kid, it's really hard to know how I'm going to protect him when at times I can't even protect myself. So I guess as I end this video, I would like some suggestions in the comments from people who have experienced racial bullying and how to stick up for yourself when you're in these situations, especially like in a school setting where there's name calling and social ostracization, etc. So if you have any tips on how to deal with that, please leave them down below. When I was in school, I basically just ignored it. I thought, I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. When I was really little, parents got involved, and I really hated that. But when I got older, and, the adults in my life thought that I should just, grow thicker skin at this point because they were tired of dealing with it, I was just like, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to not give them the satisfaction. And in the end, it just made things worse. Or if anything, things just stayed the same. I really wish I could go back in time and fight these people, but time traveling isn't an option. So that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, this video was really mainly cathartic for me to say out loud these things that, have been in my head for so long. And, for that, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you got something out of this video as well. And yeah, again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.